Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the Cambridge Union. So, this evening we are incredibly lucky to be joined by Margaret Levi and Giannis Vvaroufakis, who are in conversation about whether or not economics can be a force for good. So they're going to this and explore it from a European. They will be in Cambridge for the next 2 days, attending the Cambridge Circus Conference, which is about the future of the economic discipline. Over the next few days, they'll be discussing institutional and informational economics, for instance, but also the course of economics with the broader conversation and strive to locate, once again, its emotional pulse. It will thus engage, in addition to economics, economists, philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, and historians, as well as artists, writers, activists, and crucially, the public. Thank you to our partner Crash for organizing this event and helping facilitate the other event that Giannis will be doing at the Union. Namely, he'll be tomorrow at 6 p.m. speaking on Brexit in the shadow of capitalism's uncertain future. So without further ado, please welcome Giannis and Margaret.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Giannis has been here many times, he tells me. This is my first time. So let me sort of get the conversation going. This won't be a debate, but actually, well, it might turn into that, we'll see. But at least it will start as a conversation. And as you heard, what has brought us here is a conference that is being sponsored by Crash and the Cambridge Union, really talking about where economics is right now and how we can, what kind of crisis it's in, how we can make it work for the public good. And it's not just the economics discipline, but really thinking about the economy itself and the kinds of practices that have to be changed within the economy. And I think there's several issues that we should address. I'm suggesting this to Giannis, and it will shift as we talk, I'm sure. One is actually the nature of economics itself and how it needs to change, and we'll sort of start with that. But there are also a number of issues that we really have to think hard about, and which I know Giannis has thought very deeply about and has been very engaged with, as have I in a very different level and way, which is really thinking about the mismatch between democracy as at least rights-based democracy and capitalism, which has always been a tension, but it seems to be a particularly tough tension right now. And I think given both of our interests, although there's several major crises affecting the world right now, including the massive refugee crisis, I think we should spend a little time talking about climate change and some of the proposals that are out there that really require a different political economic framework in order to resolve them. So let me start on the economic issues and then get your response. So I'm very much an academic, and the way that I see these issues is from the role of a social scientist. And if we think about the way in which economics has developed, really over most of its lifetime, it has been based on a series of assumptions about human behavior which we no longer know to be true. We know that people are not perfectly rational, as if we ever thought they were, but at least that was the assumption under economics. We know that they're not totally individualistic or narrowly self-interested, that in fact most people are social animals and care about others and interact with each other. We know that markets aren't either free or perfect or able to solve all the problems that at least some theorists argued that they were. So we're in a world right now where the underlying assumptions of economics and the economic discipline are under question. And it's a time when we really have to think about what the alternative framework should be and how to build a framework on very different set of principles than the ones that have driven us so far. And what I want to add to that is that one of the things that we have to think about is that it's not just the assumptions that underlies economics, but economics has gained a certain currency in our world, a certain status. No policy can be done without the economists at the table. And I would like to give some status to some other people as well, equal status and equal voice. And I don't just mean political scientists like myself, or sociologists or anthropologists or psychologists, but I mean we really have to get people into the room who are experiencing the things that are happening in this world. And so that's going to lead us into thinking about what democracy looks like and what the ways in which government might decide things could look like. But Giannis, I'd be really interested to sort of get us going if you could give us some of your views about economics and where you think some of the problems are.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Margaret. It's wonderful to be here and to be engaged in this conversation because economics, well, actually the economy is far too important to be left to the economists. This is not a statement that one could make regarding civil engineering. You know, if you want to build a bridge, you need a civil engineer. If you don't have a civil engineer, you're committing a crime against humans who are going to, you know, walk on a bridge that's going to collapse. But to answer your question as succinctly as I can, and then we can move on, the problem lies exactly there. The moment certain individuals, aided and abetted by an institutional framework that involved the academy, I'm talking now around the middle of the 19th century, and the way capitalism was transforming, took it upon themselves to elevate themselves to the status of engineer or scientist of society. And to say that you can find the truth about capitalism in a system of equations that can be solved in the same way that you can determine the statics of a bridge by means of a system of equations. That is the beginning of the problem. Come to think of it, just to link it with democracy, if this mindset was correct, if this project, research project, was worthy and realistic, then we wouldn't need democracy. Anyone who has suffered economics in their undergraduate studies will recall the third chapter of microeconomics. The first one is about consumers, the second is about producers and markets, the third is about general equilibrium. It's about social welfare. And there is something called the social welfare function, right? Which everybody seeks to maximize. So if there was such a thing as a social welfare function that could be maximized by some computer or super mathematician, then what's the point of democracy? You would know, after having solved that optimization problem, what society should have. And then it would be just a technical matter of implementing it. What's the point of having debates?
So one Chicago economist that I do really respect is Ronald Coase, who brought into the set of issues here that that in fact you need government, even though he didn't quite say that, but that was the implication of what he argued. What he argued was that there was no way to figure out how a polluting factory, who had to deal with that, who was supposed to suffer, who was supposed to pay. And it turns out that what he argued was misread by most of the other Chicago economists who thought that he was saying you don't need government, that you assume perfect transaction cost, and somebody's just going to have to, whoever's got the most benefit from it, that's perfect. In fact, he was saying that you have to compensate those who are the losers in a particular set of arrangements because there aren't perfect transaction costs, there aren't perfect property rights, which means that you need government, right? So the first piece of this puzzle is that we need some government in there, and even some of the Chicago economists themselves who thought they were in denial of government begin to recognize the importance of government. Once we need government, we also need to think about how government is going to be accountable. So I don't think that economics necessarily assumed that you don't need democracy. I think that they actually assumed that democracy was absolutely essential to the protection of free markets, and that it was absolutely essential to the kind of privileges and rights that certain people got and other people did not.
Well, we need, like every sect, every religion, economics too has the canon and several heresies oscillating around it. The canon is not Coase. The canon is not Hayek. The canon is not even Friedman. The canon is general equilibrium. The idea that it starts small. You have a farmer's market, and demand and supply determine the point of equilibrium which sets the price that clears the market. And then if you say, okay, well, if that applies to one market, it applies to two markets, then you have a vector of prices, and each of these prices clears every market, and that would be the ideal world in which there can be no gains by anyone without somebody else being a loser, the Pareto criterion. And then you go beyond that, and you prove the theorem that under certain circumstances, social welfare is maximized if you can define social welfare. That is the canon. That's the Pope, if you want. And then you have Luther and Calvin and the various Arian. Now I have a theologist here looking at me saying, what the hell is this guy going on
Well,
about?
it's also the case that Luther and Calvin broke up the church.
Yeah, sure. As the neoliberals did, as the libertarians did. So, but still, the Catholic axis is there in our economics profession. And let me be a bit more precise. Second-rate economists who are running the show in government, it's not first-rate economists. In banks, in the financial sector, in KPMG, Ernst & Young and so on, they're all second-rate economists, the ones who then start applying the theory. They don't care about economics. They use economics at the back of their mind. If you say to them, if you challenge them ideologically and methodologically, so, explain what you're doing, they will remember something they heard about a certain Kenneth Arrow, a certain Frank Hahn coming from Cambridge, a certain Gerard Debreu, saying this is the thing, the whole thing is structured along an equilibrium narrative. Then the more sophisticated heretics, people like Coase, people like Hayek, what they do is they say, look, you don't have to take this for granted. We agree with you that you can't solve the mathematics. And you know what? It's a good thing that you can't solve the mathematics. You cannot prove that Adam Smith was right when he was saying that it is as if an invisible hand is synthesizing the greedy actions of each in order to produce the public good, to serve the public interest. You can't prove it. But it is precisely because no one can have a scientific understanding, conception of what is in our interest, that the market gets elevated from where Adam Smith left it. For Adam Smith, the market was a remarkable tool to serve exogenous purposes. So in Adam Smith, from the theory of moral sentiments, there was a conception of what's good for society. And the market was an instrument by which to serve it. The moment you move away from the central canon to the neo-libertarian heresies, the market is elevated from a means to an end. Since we cannot know what's good for us, the market is the only God and the only divinity that we must respect. Independently of social welfare, because social welfare cannot be defined. Because if it was definable, then there might be an argument like yours that we need government. So somebody like Robert Nozick...
Wait a minute. So yes, the economists may argue that, and many do. And there certainly are economists who think you don't need government at all. But for the most part, the economists are not the people who ultimately run the government.
That's true.
They certainly influence what happens. They certainly affect a number of policies. But they believe, and certainly I think most of us believe, that we need some form of government, and most of us would believe that we need some form of democratic government. So I see the biggest problem right now is that the kind of economic modeling that had become popular and that was very mathematical, or that was the kind that was actually beginning to influence policy, lost track of how it had to align itself with actual democracy and with democratic accountability and with what it means to have something more important, I think, than economic equality is political equality. If you don't have political equality, you can't have democracy. And what's been happening in the world, in part because of the economy, not just the economists, is there's been a really undermining of political equality in our societies. And that takes forms that we know about, like suppression of votes and ways in which elections are manipulated. But I think there's something even deeper than that, which gets back to the issue of why we need a new framework, and it has to be a political economic framework and not just an economic framework. We were talking a little bit about this at dinner, and you called it ideology and I called it beliefs. But what the framework that we've been operating with, the neoliberal framework that we've been operating with has done, I think its worst offense has been to make people believe and to get them to really think that, one, they can't change things, and two, that if anything goes wrong in their lives, it's their personal responsibility and not the responsibility of the system, and not something that they can hold someone accountable for. And the economy and economists have helped to create that situation, both with the kind of ideology that they have perpetrated through neoliberalism, those who support that particular perspective, but also with the practices of the economy that have developed over the last decades or longer, which have undermined political equality by giving corporations and big money undue influence within the polity. I mean, they've always had considerable influence, but it's gotten worse, not better, or certainly not gotten better. And we're seeing but even more important is sort of, so I grew up with, trained as an undergraduate by a political scientist named Peter Bachrach, who had a theory of non-decision making. He was really worried about black Americans. This was in the 60s, dare I say. So, when I was an undergraduate. So he was really worried about the ways in which, even if they got the vote, even if they were in the legislature, they knew that their voice didn't count. So they didn't speak up.
Why is this relevant to economics?
Because
for economics, there is no such thing as political freedom, liberty, democracy. It's simply nonsense.
If I remember right, Friedman wrote a book called Capitalism and Democracy.
Wait, yeah, but that was Schumpeter, okay? And Schumpeter would never not even have gotten a lectureship on the basis of that book, because that book is not considered to be economics by economists. You have to realize that. You know, Joe Stiglitz, for instance, would not even get a junior tutorship on the basis of everything he did after he broke ranks with the World Bank. It was, so I want to insist on what makes economic theory, firstly, so hugely powerful as a narrative, even though nobody understands it. But it's a bit like the Middle Ages. What percentage of the population during the Middle Ages understood the scriptures? Most of them couldn't even read them. But the fact that there were the priests in the monastery who understood them rendered them supremely powerful at the discursive level. That is the role of the economists. And in those scriptures of general equilibrium, which is what gives huge discursive power to the economists who, unlike Schumpeter, unlike sociologists, unlike political scientists, can say, I have wrapped up everything that matters about the economy in a system of equations, and now I'm solving them in precisely the same way that Stephen Hawking or Einstein was solving the equations of the universe. That is a very powerful narrative. I think that there are two dimensions in which this narrative gathers strength and gathers power over governments and over people. The first one is we already mentioned that, and you made a very good point. It was when political economy turned into economics.
Right.
It ditched the political. And that happened when Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism lost its moral, legal, and philosophical weight. And how did that happen? When they assumed that my utility cannot be compared to your utility, so there can be no such thing as average utility, therefore there can be no conception of the common interest out of our individual interest. Suddenly, utilitarianism was stolen by the economists, away from Bentham, it lost its character, it became a technical device. That was happening around the middle of the 19th century.
Absolutely.
Okay? So that's where we agree entirely.
But marginal utility analysis is really the big change.
No, but Bentham is marginal utility. The difference between marginalism, which we know as neoclassicism now, is the incommensurability of utilities.
No, but he was still operating within a very philosophical debate.
Yeah, because he allowed my utility to be compared to your utility.
And economics left that philosophical debate in the dust.
Can I add my second dimension, because I think it's really very important. The second dimension is the way in which the sermons of the economic religion became the ones that steadied the hand of the financiers. You see, I don't believe that economists rule the land. I don't believe that economists are writing policy. I don't believe that economists are telling the financiers what to do. The economists provide the sermons that steady the hand of those who are doing whatever they were doing anyway. So a small example, right? Financialization. How did we move in the late 60s, late 70s, from the first phase of post-war capitalism, Bretton Woods, to the financialization gone amok period that followed? You had new forms of debt being synthesized on the basis of hugely complicated mathematical formulae. These formulae had one objective: to help the investor, the person who bought those financial derivatives, estimate the risk that they were taking by buying that asset and its expected value, both of them. But of course, for these formulae to work, they had to make certain assumptions. They had to fix variables, turn variables into parameters, like correlation parameters. What is the relation between my chance of defaulting compared to your chance of defaulting, like actuarial models have. Okay? Where did they find the audacity to determine variables that no one can ever know, unknowable variables, and to fix them as parameters? They got them from the equilibrium stories of the economists. And there were revolving doors between the economists who solved mathematical models and published them in Econometrica, who were at Harvard, at Princeton, and so on. The revolving doors, they would go through the back door into Goldman Sachs. They would provide the justification for the formulae that were used in order to fix the CDOs, which then blew up and brought us 2008. Okay? And that was a mutual reinforcement mechanism between awful economic theory that in order to work had to assume there was no such thing as money, debt, time, and space, because that's what you need to assume to solve the equations, right? And then awful financial tools of mass destruction, as Warren Buffett put it. And those two, if you look at it as a political scientist, as a sociologist, as a dynamic system, reinforced each other. So, if you solve the models at Princeton, you got huge research grants from Goldman Sachs. Then you went to Goldman Sachs, and you justified what they were doing. They were making huge quantities of money. They were giving it back to the university. The university president, or dean, or whatever, had no capacity. I mean, it would take enormous knowledge and courage for the dean or the president of the college to say to some economist who was bringing in all this dough from Wall Street to say, you know what you're doing, you're a charlatan who is effectively...
So, Giannis, I totally agree with that.
So this is a dynamic process between, a little bit like the emperor and the archbishop, being codependent.
I totally agree. That's one narrative. But I think there's another, and I think it's an incredibly important narrative that you're telling. And there's no question that part of the trouble we're in is because of the financialization, and as you describe it, and have described it before so well. But I do think there's this other narrative that comes from the commitment to what we've come to call neoliberalism or supply-side economics, which was a narrative that caught on in government. And it became, and it has a very different process than the one you're talking about. It doesn't require mathematics. It requires a simple slogan about what will improve, let growth, something else we both agree about, it should not be our goal in quite the same way it has been, that we have growth will rise all boats, and growth will be accomplished by getting government out of our faces, and out of our hair, and out of our heads. And this became a very dominant, and still is to some extent, a very dominant perspective within government itself, of influencing policymakers, influencing presidents and prime ministers. And it was also, I think the other thing to point out about it, it was a political project.
Of course.
It was very much a political project.
But what I described was a political project.
Absolutely, I'm not disagreeing. I think there were two political projects. So one was the financialization project, but the other was this project. I mean, when you look at the history of how supply-side economics or neoliberalism became dominant, it's a story of a collective of people created by von Hayek initially, a group called the Mont Pelerin Society, which Milton Friedman also became president of, that were not just economists developing theory. It was people who were journalists and philanthropists and people with big money. And they became a movement that then, when the time was ripe, they took over government. And they took over government not only in terms of an ideology that then affected government, they created organizations. In the United States, for example, as I was telling Iqbal at dinner, the Federalists Society began to educate lawyers in a very concentrated way, to create a set of potential judges who could then be appointed should somebody like Trump come into office who was open to appointing those kinds of justices. And I'm not just talking about the Supreme Court here, I'm talking about the whole judiciary that is subject to central appointment. So this is a very big political project, which is not just about financialization. It's not just about the technical taking things over. It's about a model of the way in which the world works and in which economic growth is fostered that becomes the mantra of government. And we've got to change both of those things.
No, there's no doubt about that. There's no disagreement between us, Margaret. We may pretend to disagree to make the proceedings more interesting, but we're telling the same story from different angles.
Trying to get my point in.
Allow me, however, to say that if you really want to look at the history of supply-side economics, okay, there is the Mont Pelerin Society, there is Hayek, who didn't give a damn about mathematics, because for him, the market was the objective. It was not a means to an end, as I said before. But Friedman, you mentioned Friedman. Friedman's job was to go to Chicago from the Mont Pelerin Society, because Hayek was not appointable to a tenured chair, to go to Chicago and tell the same story and prepare the takeover that you were referring to, using the mathematics that I was referring to. So if you look at the supply side story, it starts with effectively, and since we're here in Cambridge, it's important to mention that, deconstructing Keynes.
Yep.
Okay? Effectively returning the pre-Keynesian idea of a perpendicular supply curve for the economy. Saying, in other words, that we live in the best of all possible capitalisms, and there is nothing you can do if you're in government, from the treasury and so on, in order to improve the performance of the economy. Whatever you try is going to damage the capacity of the economy to produce goodies for people. But the way they tried to prove that was by entering those mathematics and finding a solution to the equations that I was referring to before, in a way that was quite brutish, and which imposed the supply-side conclusions upon the theory. And again, because we're in Cambridge, I think that this is something that we must mention in relation to what Margaret correctly said. that the takeover, the neoliberal takeover, consisted effectively of two phenomena. One was the majestic organization of the neoliberals at the level of theory, of law, of banking, of creating think tanks, of funding politicians who were schooled. You know, one of them was Margaret Thatcher.
Yep.
You know, Margaret Thatcher's "There is no such thing as a society" is a direct repercussion of the work of Robert Nozick, of Friedrich Hayek, and of Friedman. So there was a continuity between their mathematics, their metaphysics, their funding, their politics, their think tanks, and so on. So that was one thing. The other thing was the collapse of Bretton Woods. Because Hayek, up until 1971, was a figure of fun. Nobody took him seriously. A tiny, tiny, tiny number of people, you know, were taking people like Friedman or Hayek seriously. It was the collapse of the planned phase of global capitalism after 1944, which did what? Fixed exchange rates, imposed capital controls. You could not just send billions at the touch of a button from one place to another, destabilizing through these massive tsunamis of financial flows, economies like Argentina, like Turkey, like France, like Britain for that matter in the 1970s. Okay? You fix exchange rates, you impose a single currency effectively, and you have a hegemon, the United States, that was recycling the surpluses of the world, which were American surpluses to begin with, and the deficits. The moment the United States lost its surplus position, that system collapsed. You have to remember, and that is, I'm going back to finance, because finance is a very important part of the post-war story, the fall and the rise of finance. The fall happened when in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt imposed one condition on the proceedings at the Bretton Woods Conference, and that is that no banker would be allowed through the door, that they should not be part of the design of global finance, which is remarkable in today's circumstances, right? So bankers were effectively eliminated. Banking became boring. If you look at the profit rates of banks, they were tiny. If you look at the significance of the banks, they were insignificant. The significance started rising the moment that model broke down, and you had a combination of inflation, which was necessary in order to devalue the level of the American debt that was the result of America losing its surplus position and going into a deficit position. The inflation was then used by the Mont-Pelerin people, by Hayek, Friedman, and so on,
and stagflation,
to create a moral panic about the loss of savings of the middle class and so on and so forth. Paul Volcker comes in with 23% interest rates, and then you have austerity. And at the level of politics, they are taking over the narrative on the basis of the perpendicular supply curve of initially Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, which of course then they ditched within a few years from taking power and privatizing the commons and privatizing everything. They ditched it because they themselves didn't believe in it so much. But they used the economic model and the mathematical solution to the general equilibrium problem. And why I think this is important here is because I feel ashamed and saddened by the fact that Cambridge used to be the only counterweight. Cambridge economics was the only counterweight to that school of thought.
It was.
That dragged the world through the mire. And today Cambridge is utterly insignificant in the world of economic thinking. This must change, and it is your business to change it.
Well, that's part of why we're here, right?
Well, but we cannot do it.
We cannot do it. You have to do it.
You have to do it.
I want to change the topic a little bit here.
Please do.
Which is following on the mathematical question, but taking it to a whole other dimension. Yep. So part of why the mathematicization of economics was so successful was it made economics inaccessible to most of us, right? So one of the things that's going on today, which is very worrying, and I know you've thought about this as have I from I live in Silicon Valley, you can see where I'm going here, is that we now give this kind of, you mentioned engineers earlier, But we're now giving a kind of power to engineers because they can solve certain problems that we as humans can't. They're creating algorithms that...
Machine learning, you mean?
All kinds of things.
Yeah,
but they're creating machine learning and algorithms that are inaccessible to us and even inaccessible to them because they don't really know why they're working. They're learning on their own. So this seems to me an analogously scary phenomenon in that, when we give power to a group of people based on a capacity to do something that we can't understand and then do not create a system of accountability. So I think it becomes back to the political as well as to the, which I'm going to keep emphasizing, and create this kind of system where we do not have accountability in the system. The big tech firms are not, they're monopolies that are not being split up. They're the people who, the founders have disproportionate stakes in shares, so they continue to control the companies as well as to get immensely rich. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about and working on is how we introduce ethical considerations and societal consequences and thinking about those things into the actual design process. And that means changing the corporations themselves. So we're back to a political economic framework here. I'll stop there and let you...
No, I endorse every word you said. Let's take every phrase, or to the extent I can remember them, one by one. The first thing you said, absolutely. Look, economists don't know anything about capitalism. But there is a delicious irony here. To be successful in our profession, you have to abstract from your models everything that makes capitalism capitalism. So debt can't be in it. Money cannot be in it. Labor cannot be in it. Labor appears as any commodity. Whether it's potatoes or labor power is the same thing. Okay? But so, in other words, by design, economists cannot explain capitalism. And their huge discursive power comes from... But they understand one thing from the real economy. The power of monopoly. So when they translate something that everybody understands into a language which is indecipherable to all of you, suddenly you think, oh my God, I didn't understand that. They do. They must be cleverer than me. I better shut up. They're the experts. So suddenly they create a monopoly power for themselves. That I understand.
Yep.
Okay? Now, the point you made about the engineers, I have enormous respect for engineers, and as you can tell, precisely zero respect for economists. Okay? And I'm speaking as an economist. So call this self-deprecation, I don't mind. But the engineers, in the same way that, come to think of it, the post-Maxwell revolution in electromagnetics brought about the second industrial revolution. And the second industrial revolution begat monsters like Edison and Henry Ford, because it allowed for the first networked company to be created. So suddenly, instead of having the baker, the butcher, and the brewer, Adam Smith's model of companies, suddenly you have Edison producing everything from electricity, the huge power generating station, to the light bulb, including the wires that were going through the streets and into your home. Now, that is a natural monopoly. Once you are hooked into this company as a worker or as a consumer, you belong to a different world. So the technological innovation, electromagnetism, and the networked monopolistic platform-like company that controls everything, it's vertically and horizontally integrated. It's not a new thing. It's not just Facebook. Facebook took it to a different level.
Oh, we've had monopolies before, yes.
That's right, but network monopolies. So there's the difference. It's one thing to be Standard Oil. You have the monopoly of oil. But Edison was a good example.
Right, that's why I said we've had those monopolies
of a network that is totally horizontally and vertically integrated. And then you have the mega banks, because you need mega finance to finance those mega networks and so on. So that's all old stuff. But you're right. With artificial intelligence and the internet, now what you have is, you remember that fantastic book by John Kenneth Galbraith, The New Industrial State, in which he refuses to talk about capitalism. This is 1965? Thereabouts.
Thereabouts.
Mid-60s. He refuses to, he said, we don't live in capitalism, this is rubbish. He called it a technostructure. And by that what he meant was that the ideology of the market is superimposed upon a system which is controlled by a technostructure, these networked firms and networked banks that create markets which then they own. You see, in Adam Smith's mindset, which is what the Adam Smith Institute in pursuing neoliberal political economics is utilizing as the narrative, in that old-fashioned liberal, not neoliberal, but liberal understanding of capitalism, you know, the market is public. But then within the market, you have individuals, privateers, competing with one another, producing good stuff, producing by means of the invisible hand, you know, the common good. But Galbraith's point was, folks, the marketplace now is private. They own it. So they control both demand and supply. They can determine what you like, not only respond to what you like. They can tell you what you like through advertising. This is 1965, well before Facebook. Now what we have with Facebook is the logical conclusion of this. You know, the most dystopic version of it, where you've got...
Just wait, we're not at the most dystopic version
No, but
yet.
it's pretty bad. If you think that Facebook pays 1% of the costs of producing Facebook to its suppliers, whether they're workers or engineers. 99% is produced by you guys.
Yep.
Or by government contracts.
Right.
Or by technologies produced by government contracts. So effectively this is massive wealth extraction from the rest of society. And in the process, the liberal individual never existed, but now it's become even more, it has receded even more into the past. Once upon a time, the idea was that as a person, you had aspirations, you had dreams, you had an identity, or you were constructing your own identity, and the market was a mechanism by which to serve your preferences. That was the ideology. Now, what I see when I look at young people, students and so on, angst-ridden because they can see that we're moving into a bipolar world, either the 0.1% or the other ones that drive Uber cars and are on zero-hour contracts. That anxiety is forcing them constantly to go onto Facebook to find out what kind of self is marketable, what kind of demand there is. So the engineers you're talking about, it's not the engineers, it's the private property rights over these means of production that are social production, totally privatized. I mean, capitalism was always predicated upon the myth that we produce individually and then the state comes and collectivizes through taxation. No, it was always the opposite. We produce socially and then some manage to privatize the wealth that we produce. Now we have this situation where Facebook, Google, and all the rest are making all of us work to produce their capital, they're getting their returns, and they then use those huge returns, huge economic rents, they're not profits, they're economic rents, in order to influence what we think,
Absolutely.
to usurp politics, and to usurp government.
So how do we use that? That's what I am really interested in.
We nationalize it.
Yeah, we can nationalize. But I'm thinking more about how do we mobilize, not just nationalize. How do we use this fact that we can all experience and see that these companies are producing these inordinately rich people where others are not, that they put a lie to the kind of mythology of the ways in which markets work, that they're not really free markets, they're not really serving all of us, that they really raise the contradictions of contemporary capitalism. And I think they do. And I think that and I also want to say one other thing before I go on with that thought. So one of the projects that I've been, that's happening out of the center that I run at Stanford, and that has been really remarkable, has been studying people basically the age of those of you who are students here. Those who grew up digitally native. And what it's finding is not what you described about young people. It's finding that, in fact, you're discovering all kinds of new ways to connect to each other that we tried in our own ways, but without your technology. And that if that technology can be very powerful in order to bring people together across divides and across spaces that were never available to us in the 60s and in the 70s and until very recently. You're also finding new forms of identity, new ways of creating communities, new ways of solving problems. So I want to figure out how to take that.
You sound like Zuckerberg now. You sound like
I am not Zuckerberg.
A Facebook evangelist.
And we pronounce him Zuckerberg. But several of you are calling him. Anyway, I'm not Zuckerberg. I'm looking at what is happening here. God, look, I did not come in my private plane. So, no, I think to say that there are some possibilities in the technology and some ways in which young people, these young people here and others, have the capacity to change the world. So, you know, you and I are both concerned, and probably many people here, about climate change, for example. Well, the capacity to mobilize people around climate change, to be thinking about that, to share information about that, is really enhanced by the technology. So part of what we have to think about in thinking about a new political economic framework is to really think about how to control the technology as it is now so that it serves us, and then to make it serve us. And that seems to me a role that is partially getting government to act, so that it is intervening to ensure that there aren't so many monopoly rents, that the stakeholders have some say, that these companies aren't allowed to do things like allow the Russians to influence elections. I mean, all of those things need to be controlled, for sure. But we also have to recognize, as in the past, that these technological changes can be used to enhance us, to enable us to flourish, to be made to work for us. And so when I think about creating a new political economic framework, I want it to be an ethical political economic framework, what we call a moral political economic framework, but that takes advantage of where we are now, which is one that we have to recognize that there are these new technological possibilities, which in the hands of the next generation could be made to work for the good, just as electricity ended up helping us. And that we as a society really have to think about how do we use these technologies to help us build not just better economies and better well-being, but also how to create, and I come back to this question because I think it's a critical one. If we're going to sustain democracy, we need political equality. And these technologies can be used to help do that. And so I want to think about those questions.
As long as we challenge and totally reconfigure property rights over the technology.
I agree.
We cannot do it simply by redistributing the profits of Google and of Amazon. We cannot expect governments to do the right thing on our behalf. Governments will always be in their pocket, not in ours. So we need direct action. I would like to see, for instance, an Amazon strike. You know, people agreeing that for one day, across the world, we are going to protest the wages that Amazon pays its employees. And let's organize, you know, like we have a worldwide protest on Fridays against climate extinction and so on. Let's say that for one day, nobody buys Amazon. Nobody clicks on Amazon. This is going to be so devastating for Amazon. It's going to crush its shares. It can have a remarkable effect. And I think that it would be possible to engage young people's native use of social media and new technologies to organize that kind of action against the owners of the technologies who are putting the technologies to use in a particular way that creates bad quality jobs for youngsters and so on. And we have to do something very similar about climate change.
So I think that the issue, I agree, I'm all for the strike and I'll join it. But I think it shouldn't just be about the poor wages for workers, because that's actually something they keep responding to. So Amazon now has a $15 minimum wage, which is good in the United States, unfortunately. But what they have done, which I think is even worse, and this is not to defend the wage structure there, is to make us make us such consumer-oriented people, that this is how our identity is formed, by having these products and these shiny goods. And that's what we really have to strike about. That's what we really have to say, no, that is not the world we want. We don't want a world which is defined by what we own. We want a world defined by what we can be, who we want to be, how we can do things. So strike, let's organize that.
Well, going back to the original topic, let me connect the original topic which you brought up about the model of Homo economicus, the model of the rational economic man, and it is a man, can't be a woman.
Because we're not rational?
To be a woman. Yeah, rational economic man, you know. Actually,
but why can't it be a woman? Because we're not why can't
No, because the rational economic man is so stupid and irrational that it cannot possibly be a woman.
Okay.
And when I say rational economic man, I mean the model of persons coming out of the textbook of economics. Because, you see, the reason why I'm connecting to this is this. Okay, ask yourself the question. How do economists, the textbook that all of you will have to suffer if you ever study economics, how does the textbook define rationality? Rationality is instrumental, means ends. So you are defined as a bundle of preferences that is exogenous. Your rationality does not have the right to pass judgment on your preferences. So if you have a preference for, you know, taking this bottle and smashing it against your head, that's just as good a preference as reading Shakespeare, right? So your reason has no capacity. The only thing your reason does, in a Humean kind of way, but in the brutish version of Hume, the only thing that your reason can do is can instruct you, given your preferences and your constraints, what maximizes your preference satisfaction. So if, you know, if bashing your head against the wall is that's what your rationality. Your rationality does not have the capacity to say to you, you know what, you want to be consuming like there is no tomorrow, but maybe you should be thinking of something else as a more worthy preference. Your rationality in economic textbook cannot do that. Because, of course, if it could, then you wouldn't be able to maximize your utility subject to constraints, and then the mathematics would not be solvable.
Right.
So I'm going back to the solvability. The importance of embracing indeterminacy in economic theory is hugely important for getting out of consumerism as a mindset. And to do that, we have to challenge the concept of rationality that economists, you know, after 5,000 years of a debate amongst the great philosophers and people on the street about what it means to be smart, what it means to be rational, what it means to be wise. That has all been destroyed and condensed in half a page of an economics textbook. A person is rational to the extent that it's always he can efficiently maximize his utility subject to his constraints. That is, if you want, the most toxic piece of political philosophy and moral philosophy, which underpins the whole mindset of consumerism, of treating others as a means to an end, of never being able to resist a net increase in your utility, even if it means that the world would be saved if you did. So challenging your own preferences, which is what, you know, used to be the mainstay of wisdom, has now been banned because it has been identified by economists as irrational. So that kind of rationality is only male and stupid.
Okay. I think we should stop there. That was a great point to stop with in order to allow questions, which I believe is what we're supposed to do now.
This chair is far too comfortable. We shouldn't be comfortable when we're having this debate. Don't you think?
I'm not comfortable.
Okay. I was.
Well, I have my speaker, my little thing on my back, so when I lean back like this.
Okay. Who is moderating?
Yeah, we can't call on people, so somebody...
Come on, Rachel, get up. Do your job. Decide who asks questions.
That's my job. Right, so who would like to ask the first question? I pick women and then men in that order.
Very good.
So who wants to go first? Should we start with
Yeah, it's coming. Rachel will give it to me. All right.
Thank you both so much. I couldn't have asked for a better launch for the revival of the Cambridge Circus, and I'll also use this to make the plug that if any of this appeals to you and you want to join the epistemic revolution, we have a hashtag Cambridge Circus, so do please follow our activities, and we'll be having many more conversations of this kind. But again, really, I mean, from the bottom of my heart, thank you both. But I just want to push both of you, to sort of, as the culmination of your really rich comments, can economics be a force for good? What are both your answers and how?
Yes, as long as it embraces indeterminacy and stops pretending that it is possible to separate the political, the psychological, the artistic, the philosophical from the economic.
I agree. I mean, I think one of the problems with economics is that it is what we've talked about. But I think its salvation, I mean, it has a lot that it has taught us. I mean, you're a card-carrying economist. I'm a partial card-carrying economist. And I think the way in which you can think about not rational human beings as being, I think we are rational, but we're not perfectly rational, and we have other things we care about. So thinking about the ways in which we make decisions that uses some of the economic theory, I think, is useful to us. But it's not useful by itself. So I'm really an advocate of a new kind of, sort of going back to what we've done in the past, but moving it into the future version of it. We used to have philosophy, politics, and economics as a major thing. It's not so much anymore, but
except in the other place, which produced terrible prime ministers.
And it's not even such a big thing in the other place anymore. But I was just on a panel with Raj Chetty, who's a very famous contemporary young economist, and he was advocating along with me the importance of, if we're going to really solve the world's problems, which is, we need economics, but we also need a lot of other things. And so the world that we have to live in now is not an economist or anything else, just making a plan on his or her own, but as part of a collaborative of all those whose skills are needed, because none of us can know everything or specialize in everything, all those whose skills are needed to actually solve that problem. So engineers, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, physicists, if we need them, all together, working together to solve the problem.
Wonderful, thank you.
We have a question up there.
Given that there's quite a few financial incentives to keep the current system as it is, like what you mentioned with Goldman Sachs.
Oh, there you are.
Do you see sort of any sequence of steps to get us to this model of economics which you want, which is not just completely revolutionary? Or do you see any sort of mechanisms which could get us there step by step? For example, something like quadratic voting or something.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what that last one was, the progressive.
I said something that might be able to get us to this model of economics which you suggest, which is not just entirely revolutionary. And actually might involve some sort of progressive sequence of steps. An example might be quadratic voting, like suggested by Glenn Whale or something like that.
You start.
Okay. So I think the first step has already been taken in the sense that we're at a moment when the current way of thinking about things is clearly failing us. And we're seeing that in so many ways, that so many people are dissatisfied with the political economic framework in which we're currently existing. And it's taking all kinds of forms, some positive, some problematic. Okay? So I think that's step one, to create the space where some change can occur. I think there are a lot of very interesting experiments going on, which I think we need to pay attention to in a more systematic way. So you mentioned quadratic voting. That's one of the kinds of experiments that's going on. Glenn Weil's work on some of that. And he ran a conference, or created a group called Radical Exchange, which had a whole group of people who were doing amazing things with quadratic voting, with blockchains, with old forms of community organizing, and trying to create experiments. In fact, you and Federica Antara have been collecting some of these experiments to show us, to sort of pave a way towards the future, to think that there is actually proof of concept here. I think things like the Green New Deal, and there are 3 or 4 variants of it depending on countries, are another really important step in the right direction. Whether we ever accept exactly any one of them is not so important, as that they're on the table and they're creating a real debate. Some of it taking place in legislatures, some of it taking place outside of legislatures, and ultimately the change agents are going to be you. I mean, we have to act as citizens in order to make these things happen. We can use these experiments and these ideas that are already there, but if we don't get in the streets and get in the voting booths, we've given it away to corporate power.
To have a genuine paradigm shift, you need a big crisis. And you must make sure that you don't let it go to waste.
Well, that's true.
So every shift in economic thinking happened after such a crisis. If you think about it, Adam Smith started thinking about the wealth of nations only in response to the momentous crisis of the 1760s and 1770s, when mechanization, following the enclosures, had created immense poverty and deprivation that had never been encountered before during the previous centuries, and at the same time immense wealth. And people were asking questions, well, then what on earth is going on? And it was clear that nobody knew what had happened. There was no satanic plan by anyone. And that's why Adam Smith became so famous, because he came out and said it is as if by an invisible hand these forces are doing this and that and the other. And then in the 1840s, particularly the revolutions of 1848, you had the emergence of the Proletariat with, Marx and Engels effectively using the first serious crisis of what was new then, capitalism, to write the first passages of what then became Das Kapital, and then was given its genuine opportunity after the 1880s, the great crisis of the Great Depression of the 1880s. And then it was 1929 that here gave rise to Keynes. And it was, as we said before, it was the end of Bretton Woods and stagflation and inflation that allowed the Montpellier society and the neoliberals to take over. The tragedy of 2008 was it was our moment, the moment of progressives, to take charge of a world in which financialized capitalism was collapsing, to wrestle the power from those who had brought this calamity upon humanity, and we didn't, because we were not ready, and because good people like Barack Obama reappointed the same people who had liberalized the markets, the financial markets, to fix the crime, effectively to bandage the victims, their own victims. So it is important, what's happening here with the Cambridge Circus and so on, think of it as preparing ourselves and our mindset so that when the next crisis happens, we don't prove as idiotic as we did in 2008.
Absolutely.
We need a microphone. There it is.
What was the biggest mistake that each of you made in your career in terms of understanding economics?
Well, I'll tell you that. I will answer that first.
I'm not an economist.
There, she's free. Scot-free. The biggest mistake was when I was younger and more stupid than I am now. And I too believed the economists, radical economists' narrative that it is possible to capture the essence of capitalism in a few well-chosen equations. Not the ones of the neoclassicists, But I come from the Marxist tradition. And looking at the way in which Marxist thinking transformed from the dialectical Hegelian early start into the equations and schemas of reproduction of his later work, I thought I agreed with him that this was the way to go. Now I've concluded that that was my greatest mistake and his greatest mistake. Keynes' greatest mistake was that he confused his readers and himself in the general theory by trying to tell a story which was absolutely important. And what was the story? That we're damned if we know. That was what was important. If you want to summarize Keynes' general theory, that's it. We are damned if we know. In other words, because there is indeterminacy, there is no direct correspondence, one-to-one and on-to relationship, in other words, a mathematical function, relating the rate of interest with the level of investment. This is where the predicament we find ourselves in today. Central banks keep pushing the interest rate down, hoping that investment will rise because they think there is a downward sloping demand curve. But Keynes had already told them in the 1930s, there is no such relationship between, because once you have diversity, you have different kinds of investors, you have different kinds of consumers, you have workers that are on zero-hour contracts, you have others that are more privileged and so on. If you have diversity, you have effectively you have multiple equilibria, to put it in more mathematical terms. And some of them are terrible, some of them are better, some of them are mediocre. And no one can tell you which equilibrium society is going to select, the dynamic process. But even he had this fantastic idea. That was why we remember of Keynes fondly and why he has empowered us. But in the same book, he tries to fix it, and he has silly little models and diagrams with the marginal efficiency of capital and so on, because the lure of mathematics and determinacy is extremely powerful. You know, it captures you. Everybody wants to be the scientist of society and to solve it. If I give you two equations in two unknowns, I think that most of you will have an urge to solve it. And without knowing what these are. And, okay, if x equals 3.4, so what? So that was my greatest mistake as an economist. Wait. You need to be broadcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's very interesting. I was wondering, since your moral vision, ideology, whatever, is so linked up with political equality, what would your response or what would your point of conviction be with response to China? Because I just see the elephant in the room that you have addressed everything. New political framework. And if we know one thing, it is that the CCP is not going to democratize.
The what?
It's not going to democratize.
It's not going to democratize
the Chinese Communist Party. Right.
My question would be, what is that moral vision in response to the challenge? And not just maybe from an American point of view, but as a
You'll get the Greek
challenge.
point of view here.
Yeah, so from a Greek point of view.
So I should clarify, and thank you for asking me to do that, that the scope condition for what I'm talking about is capitalist democracies. So China's not one of those. Yeah, so I'm not going to punt. I'm just saying, but let me be clear about that what I'm talking about in terms of creating a moral political economy is not about China. Now, China has a moral political economy. In fact, all political economies are moral. They have some values that they're expressing. So the real question about, I think there's several questions on the table really about China. One is, we're back in a form of Cold War here. It's different Cold War than the past. There's luckily not a nuclear threat, though there are other kinds of threats. But we're certainly in some kind of competition with China for who's going to dominate not just trade, but sort of ways of thinking. I mean, it is an alternative vision. So what China offers to its people, I mean, there are lots of people in China who love what's happening. China 30, 40 years ago had immense poverty. It has done more than any other country in the world in getting people out of poverty. So there is a trade-off there between getting material well-being and getting certain kinds of political rights. So they've come from a different place than many other countries that we're talking about here. So that's one thing to keep in mind about China, that they see their government, some of them, as delivering the goods, that it's trustworthy in certain kinds of respects. They may not care about democracy. And it's not a capitalist system that doesn't depend on democracy. Thank you. So, that may be the wrong expectation to think that democracy has to happen in China. On the other hand, I think they're going to face a huge crisis themselves in the not-too-distant future. One is a result of their demographic crisis, that they don't have enough workers for the work that they want done, and that they're engaging in all kinds of practices now under the guise of anti-corruption and control of the population that may evoke a new Chinese revolution. But I think that's an open question, what will happen.
From my perspective, let me tell you that, first, I reject our Western depiction of the world as one that comprises democracies, and we are that, and China, on the other hand, which is not a democracy. Ever since, in particular, I got involved in politics, my belief, conviction that we live in democracies has been shaken to the ground. At the very same time, in China, there is an unsung but very interesting and boisterous democracy that is emerging at the local level. If you look at what happens in the prefectures around China, the degree to which accountability is returning or is being established, to which local officials are overthrown through elections and against the decisions of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party is quite happy to let democracy grow at the grassroots level as long as its own authority nationwide is not challenged. But that creates what we Democrats would like to see in our democracies. Grassroots, regional, local government that actually has tools, because the Cambridge local authority doesn't have that many tools, especially after Thatcher took them all away. There they have tools. They have a remarkable degree of autonomy when it comes in particular to property rights, which is what we were discussing before. So if you look at, even the large corporations like Alibaba and so on, that are now more or less equivalent in size to the Googles and the Facebooks. These are gigantic corporations. There is something that I find appealing and not democratic, but amenable to a democratic process in China. The contract between the state and Alibaba, for instance, is that your license can be revoked at any moment in time, and your shares can be expropriated at any point in time if you don't fulfill condition A, B, C, D, according to some kind of moral, political principles. Of course, what I cannot possibly accept is that the Communist Party, and the authoritarian Communist Party, is the arbiter of whether those conditions are upheld. But imagine that instead of the Communist Party, you had a citizens' assembly through sortition and through other ways of involving local communities, regional communities, or the national community to say to the company that has the right to be exploiting a certain resource, whether it is digital or non-digital or farming or whatever, to say to them, listen, you're being watched by a citizens' assembly that has the right to revoke your property rights. To me, that is a major opportunity, and we should be, learning lessons from China. As for climate change, do you know that in the last 12 months, in China, new renewables were introduced that produce amongst them, only the new ones of the last 12 months, produce more electricity from renewables than the sum of all kilowatts produced by France and Germany. So, yeah, whereas we are talking about the Green New Deal, they're actually doing it. And, you know, to the extent that the demos needs air to breathe, and it needs to be able to tackle the challenge of climate change, we have to learn a lot. And what really upsets me is the way in which our own political regimes are treating us like complete fools. I remember George Osborne, your very own George Osborne. Remember when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he went to China and said to the Chinese, "We are your people. Come to London, we will make the city the renminbi center of the world, and you can have anything you want." So we went from that to the demonization of China today by the same people, by the same governments. Now, clearly, China is what it was back then today. I mean, if it deserved criticism then, it deserves criticism today. But to go from one to another, to go from the country whose economic policy saved
More people.
saved the world
Yeah.
after 2008. Two things saved capitalism, if you want, from completely collapsing: the Fed and China. And to have Trump portraying China as the great enemy that needs to be put in its place, and the whole process of effectively building up geopolitical tensions that Obama started, by the way, with TPP. The whole point of TPP was to encircle China. So I get really very scared about that, because I see a fading United States of America trying to preserve its exorbitant privilege through increasing militarization and increasing trade conflict, a conflictual trade stance, with this portrayal of China as a dictatorship, whereas Trump's America is a brilliant democracy.
Hardly.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you. So I guess my question is, at this stage, whether there's still a point to trying to save economics from within. I mean, assuming that it's based on fallacies, most of it, it has real effects of violence, and also that it keeps perpetuating itself, is taking some of its assumptions and trying to build on them, change them, make them more heterodox, really going to work? Or so we work without economics, so we work from other disciplines in order to critique it, to expose the real violence that is affecting, the way it sustains and develops relationships with domination, in order to undermine it. And also connecting to sort of something you've said, Giannis. You said that you were the priest who didn't believe. You were teaching neoliberal economics, but you didn't really believe it.
Yeah,
your advice, yes, your advice for a younger generation, would it be exactly that, to actually master neoliberal economics, to master orthodox thinking, in order to then be able to critique it from within, with the dangers of getting lost in this theology, right? Being co-opted by the system and ending up doing consulting somewhere without really thinking about it? Or should you actually choose from the outset to reject this path, display a radical exteriority to the system of violence, and critique it from without?
Well, thank you. This is a brilliant question. Let me say that, for a start, I believe that every citizen of the world should study, even on their own, you know, home study, the best of the neoclassical, neoliberal models, at least to understand their essence. Because, you know, as Voltaire said, I believe, if you really want to be an atheist, you've got to understand the scriptures better than the Pope. Otherwise, you know, you can't have a debate with them in the language of the establishment, and the language of the establishment is that language. So you need to speak it in order to, as a citizen, to participate in debates. If you don't understand the language of economics, if they can say something that bamboozles you on a television panel, right, that's it. You've given them a huge advantage, and an advantage that they don't deserve. Now, the question, the first part of the question, is one that gives me much more trepidation. Because, had you asked me 15 years ago, is it worth it sticking into, you know, staying within economics and trying to change it from within, I would have said yes. because this is what I was trying to do, this is what I was encouraging my students to do, this is what, with Nicholas Theocharakis, we taught together on a PhD program that was set up precisely for that purpose. I would have said yes. Now I'm not so sure. And I'll tell you why I'm not so sure, because I've watched the way in which good people have been destroyed within economics departments. Because if you really want to stay within an economics department, you need to publish. And you need to publish the journals that the profession recognizes, not the ones in which you want to publish, or the ones that want to publish interesting things, like the conversation we're having. This conversation would never be published in any economics journal. So you need to invest decades of your life in doing the gymnastics, the mathematical gymnastics of the profession, in order to establish yourself, so that at some point when you're 50, you can turn around like Joe Stiglitz did and say it's all rubbish and it's all toxic and we have to turn against it. Now,
and after he's won the Nobel
how
Prize.
many people can do that? How many people can sacrifice their youth doing, you know, interesting work, which, however they understand, is firstly moral philosophical poison because of Homo economicus, and secondly, it is completely irrelevant to the real capitalism out there. You know, it is much more likely that at some point, if you keep doing this through the process that psychologists refer to as the removal of cognitive dissonance, that at some point you start believing in it. And you will end up like all good mathematical economists who become, in their 80s, social democrats. But then they have to reject everything they've done. And they go, you know, you have Kenneth Arrow, Nobel Prize, the whole thing. In the end, everything he was saying, when he was asked what was his view about George W. Bush's economics, it was all perfect, had nothing to do with his economics. So can I, in good conscience, advise young students to do this? I can't.
So I want to be even a little more radical. I don't think it's just economics. I think it's all of our disciplines, that they're all reproducing that same kind of problem. I agree that we need to know enough to be able to speak truth to power, and that requires understanding some of the tools. But the silos that we have been placed in by the specialization of disciplines and the kind of credentialism that we have to achieve. Now, I'm not quite in my 80s, but I'm at that point where I can say throw it all away. Is really problematic, and it's not a healthy way to learn. That we really have to, you know, there are things we need to specialize in for sure, and we can learn those tools, but they should always be in combination with other things. We should be aware of the arts at all times. We should be aware of literature. We should be aware of science, hard science. We should understand philosophy. I mean, we need to go back, in a sense, and rediscover and then recreate in a new way what we used to call the liberal arts education, where it's not just these series of people in little tiny silos who can't even talk across the silos, can't even talk to their neighbor in the office next door because they're in a different subspecialty. So it's not just economics, I want to say. And if we really want to build a new political economy, we need all of us working together with our special skills and understandings and speaking to each other and understanding each other.
Before you clap, can I say one thing? I'd never believed in the last 3 years that I would spend 1.5 hours with the good people of this country and not mention Brexit. So thank you very much. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's fun.
Thank you to both for such a fruitful conversation and also for answering all the questions that our student body had. Just a reminder, can everyone please stay in their seats until Giannis and Margaret have exited and their guests have exited. I'm sure you won't be that long, but you guys stay in your seats. So leave a warm round of applause.